Aaron told me there were going to be.
And Andrew Immerman.
Thank you. Well, hello, everybody. What I'd like to do here is give everyone, through the course of this next hour or so. Oh, am I loud enough? Can people hear me in the back? No. What I'd like to do is, over the course of the next hour or so, give you all an introduction to digital forensics from a procedure point of view. And as Mr. Henry put forward, the field has a lot of software in it that actually does a good deal to resist forensics. But most of the time, when you're dealing from a professional standpoint with forensics, you're dealing with, well, corporate collar types where they don't know what the tools are out there, and you usually have a pretty good chance of finding some good data. So we'll try to cover that. And of course, a couple of introductory notes. There's a lot that I'm going to go through. So please feel free. I'm going to make this live and available. So you should be able to download this from the LayerOne site. So if you have any questions, also please hold them to the end. So there's 8 topics that I'm going to cover here. The ones to focus on are the ones in bold. So I'm going to provide you a conceptual introduction of forensics. Go through briefly a slide or two on the anatomy of malice, which talks about the anatomy of an investigation. Digital evidence, forensic procedure, which is where I spend most of my time, forensic tools and techniques, just some tools to basically have you look up, because most of us know how to run man, and so between the internet and man, you've got a pretty good shot of finding out how these tools work and how powerful they are. A brief section on counterforensics, which I'll just glaze through, forensic hardening for the corporate types who want to protect their systems, and some further educational resources. By the end of this, hopefully all of us can become digital proctologists. So the definition of forensic science: it's the use of science and technology to investigate and establish facts to facilitate a decisive action, which means there has to be a plan and a procedure to it. Also, an argumentative exercise. Now, this might seem funny, but in reality, forensics is the art of challenging things. So it is something of a debate team, so to speak. A forensics team is a debate team. Where in digital forensics, the subject of your investigation is going to be digital data. Data storage systems are where you're going to be looking, and obviously evidential discovery. So a couple of critical distinctions I'd like to make. First is forensics versus security. Security, in a sense, is anti-forensics. So the more secure your system is, in reality, the less vulnerable it is, so to speak, to forensics. So forensics facilitates discovery where security, from that point of view, resists it. Vital versus post-mortem versus recovery forensics, where vital forensics happens on a live system. It's dynamic, they're evolving. The frightening piece here is that you're working against time. Time is your enemy. Post-mortem forensics, you have more time on your side, but as the tools are getting more advanced and as cryptography is coming into play and people have encrypted file systems, you don't have as much time to do post-mortem discovery, and vital discovery usually provides far more insight into a system and its attack. And then there's obviously recovery, which is also an element. The last distinction is archaeology versus geology. This is a term I've borrowed from Dan Farmer from the Coroner's Toolkit, where archaeology studies the direct effects of humans and geology studies the effects of autonomous systems. So the first piece to being a forensic investigator is discovery, seizure, and preservation. So from a discovery point of view, there's the discovery of raw data, both in vital and in post-mortem forensics, electronic surveillance. There's seizure and preservation, so to borrow the term from layer 1 through the abstraction layers, you want to work from the lowest level possible. So analyzing a bit stream is usually far more productive than looking at the actual application data. From volatile to non-volatile, so this we'll talk about later in terms of order of volatility. knowing the geological terrain. So, for example, it's critical that you know how your Linux system works or how your Windows system works, how the NTFS file system really stores data. You know, what are these metadata that's stored along with files like file names and file times, and what does all this mean? Avoiding malware and documenting everything. Recognition of digital evidence is also the responsibility of an investigator. You have to be able to identify it and chain of custody, which we'll talk about a bit later. Duplication, distillation, and conversion. Now, as we'll talk about later in the evidence section, following industry standards is a really important thing. This is what's going to define whether or not a court accepts the evidence that you put forth. So duplicates must support independent verification. Duplicates must be tamper-proof, and to quote the Federal Rules of Evidence, if data are stored in a computer or similar device, any printout or other output readable by sight, shown to reflect the data accurately, is an original. This basically facilitates digital evidence. And then conversion, both for analysis and representation. Analysis and reporting, finding out the who, what, where, when, why, and how, finding the needle in the haystack, and then being able to report on it. Expert testimony, being experienced enough and having the expertise to be able to provide expert testimony. And this can be something of a challenge, since if you haven't in the past provided expert testimony, it makes it very difficult to put you on the stage because your credibility is brought into question, which means your first case is usually the hardest. And then having both being a durable expert witness and durable expert testimony, which we'll talk about. Being a tactical strategist, both providing insight to your customers as to what their objectives should be, and then defining tactics to implement. And then consulting in business operations. And since this is mostly collar stuff, I'll skip through that really quickly. Consultation, and of course, wonderful quote from despair.com, if you're not part of the solution, there's good money to be made in prolonging the problem. A couple of professional requirements. This is the touchy-feely part of my presentation. You've got to be an expert in both volatile and non-volatile digital data, in tools and techniques. Now, when I say government, anytime you do an investigation, there is a government of sorts. There's policies and procedures to follow. There might be laws. If you're following something for criminal procedure, there's other requirements. So you have to know what the government is, and also there's a certain amount of etiquette that you have to follow in taking a system. Obviously, walking into an office and shooting everybody who's in there other than the investigation team is usually not good etiquette. Secure and private work environment, self-knowledge and experience. Knowing your limitations is very important. And the last piece of just a couple of words of advice moving forward. Crisis management is the art of slowing things down. And that's what you're doing in forensics, is slowing things down, so to speak. Got to be methodical, perform checklists, and at the end, just remember Murphy's laws. So the anatomy of malice. I'm going to let you read through the intrusion scenario since it's just a bunch of terms. The questions to ask are, was this inadvertent or malicious? This will help determine how you take your course with forensics. Was this the target or merely an instrument of the act? So for example, is this computer just one stepping point for somebody who wants to gain access to something else in the network? For example, print servers used to be very common as an entry point for attacks. So if you're investigating a print server, it's merely the instrument of the attack. Espionage versus sabotage, and whether or not it was premeditated. If you can determine that it wasn't premeditated, then you usually have more options because there's more carelessness to deal with. So evidence, to quickly gun through this. Primary evidence is supportive evidence, counter-supportive evidence, and controversial evidence, all of which are very important. If you don't have evidence and counter-supportive evidence saying, so the first question says, this is evidence that it happened. This is evidence to support that it didn't happen this way or this way or this way, that it did in fact happen this original way, and then controversial evidence is evidence that you're not sure what to make of. Secondary evidence is that of discovery, or destruction rather, concealment, fabrication, forgery. And then the different types of evidence are fossilized artifacts or residual evidence. So then there's the questions of government. What are the objectives of the forensic investigation? This is a very important question so you know what it is you're looking for. Who will receive the forensic analysis? What are the subjects of this forensic investigation? So what machines are you going to look at? What data? How many hard drives are we talking about here? Are we looking at memory as well? And what governs this forensic investigation, which goes back to government? In the US court, the applicable types of law are electronic search and seizure law, which is Still fairly undeveloped, so there are both strengths and weaknesses to the forensic investigator because it's an undeveloped area. Electronic surveillance law and the admissibility of digital evidence, which is what we'll talk about here. And, of course, just listing out some legal aspects. Legal search and seizure. So this goes back to the Fourth Amendment. There's some interesting timing issues with digital evidence, and I'll direct your attention at some point to, if you're interested, and this will be in the download, Oren Kerr, and he has some interesting articles on the legality of certain types of digital evidence, and there are links at the end of this. Is it authenticated evidence? Follow the best evidence rule. So to give you an example of the best evidence rule, Fry versus the US, the determination was made for the results of a scientific technique to be admissible. The technique must be sufficiently established to have gained general acceptance in its particular field. This is the general acceptance test that often requires knowledge of the literature. So this comes back to using standardized tools. So even though EnCase has its weaknesses, there is a benefit to going back to EnCase and confirming your results in EnCase so that your evidence is more admissible. And then exceptions to the hearsay rule. Obviously, digital evidence is interesting in that, in a manner of speaking, it's all hearsay. But the courts have recently ruled, or actually not so recently, but they've ruled that digital evidence is not considered hearsay because it's a result of machine storage. And one last comment that I'll make here, I was too embarrassed to put that there were actually digital rights laws that came out of the US v. Simpson trial, but there's some interesting stuff in there about chat room logs and how they are admissible as an admission of guilt. So the viability of evidence, the questions are, is it admissible, which we already covered? Is it applicable, so real and relevant? Is it verifiable? Is it reliable, receivable, complete, and convincing? If you can't answer these questions, then your evidence probably doesn't belong either to the people that you requested that you find it or the courts, and the courts won't accept it. You'll have no ability to defend the evidence. So forensic procedure, this is the more interesting part. Preparation, collection, preservation, analysis, and presentation. Starting from the preparation. You have an incident statement. What is the discovery timeline? So the corporate officer who calls you into his office and says, something happened. How did he discover this? What are the hypotheses about whether or not, what kind of an attack it is? What's the purpose of it? What were they after? And what mitigating actions did they take to try to deal with the situation? Establish and prioritize objectives. So this goes back down to SMART objectives, which is an acronym for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-based. It's a good measurement as to whether or not your objectives apply. Establish constraints. What regulatory concerns do you have? What's the incident response plan, the IRP and the BCP, the business continuity plan? What do you have to follow? Mobilize your team. You need both specialists and also a couple of things just to mention here. Having legal counsel is usually a very good idea, and working in pairs is a very good idea. Mobilize your tools. So you have your dedicated environment and your identification, capture, and archival tools and industry standard tools. Now, before I move on, I will mention that there was another standard that came out of the Coppolino court case. The court allows a novel test or piece of new, sometimes controversial science on a particular problem at hand if an adequate foundation can be laid. So as long as your evidence follows the no scientific jargon test and the standard that you use to capture the evidence follows that, then it can be admissible. But as I said before, it's usually a good idea to use industry standard tools that are recognizable. Brief your team, so define roles and responsibilities and issue credentials. And then collect incident relevant materials, both specifications and schematics, topologies, diagrams, the access control list, who had access to that system and when. A quick aside here, the key to forensics is that computers lie. Deletion, as we all know, doesn't really delete data. It simply marks it as available for overwrite, which means it's still there. Overwriting data tends to leave analog residuals, and discharge, when it comes to memory, turns out that it doesn't really necessarily discharge data. In the case of RAM, it turns out that many manufacturers, at least for a while, were building in diagnostic modes that allowed you to see what the last state of the RAM was, and to do dumps, at least to some degree, usually of lower memory, but it still provided some insight. And not to go any further with this, I'll just pass along a couple of interesting tidbits. Peter Gutmann wrote some amazing articles, and if you go to the Vico site, you can actually see pictures of hard drives and the residual data that's left behind once you overwrite it. So in a sense, there's a magnetic residual so that if for some reason you happen to have an electron scanning microscope in your basement, you might be able to turn up evidence that's been overwritten a few times. But there's some really amazing pictures at Vico, and they have it, not just their nanotheater is really, really neat. So moving into the interesting part, collection. So again, you want to go for first layer collections. Data preservation, integrity, and documentation are all challenges that you have to remember, and that will equal your evidence viability. And then there's contamination challenges. There's normal deterioration that the system is going to put on the system or on your data set. So as time goes on to overwrite, it will overwrite files by allowing that unallocated space to be used. Examination contamination. In simply doing a directory listing, for example, on an ext2 or ext3 file system, you're going to overwrite the access time of the directory. So again, there's sensitivity there. System malfunction, negligence, all of the rest of the stuff. Tamperware, both user and kernel. I'll just talk about that just briefly. The user space tamperware, that's been around for a while in the form of replacing executables, the rootkits, and also replacing libraries, but there's some very neat stuff in the kernel world where people will replace the low-level write calls. So they don't need to replace the libraries, and some of the rootkits can't detect this because it's kernel level. So something to pay attention to. So for example, I've seen people bitten by the fact that sync makes low-level kernel calls, and they didn't have to replace sync because it passed the check root test, but unfortunately, kernel-wise, it didn't. And so the low-level calls to synchronize memory to file system resulted in corrupted file system. Identify your potential sources. So the first bit here is think big. So think enterprise. Don't think about one host. Think about a network. Don't think about one disk. Think about things in terms of a RAID, so to speak. If you turn to your, this is just an example, obviously, for thinking in the enterprise way. And think peripheral devices. There might be keystroke loggers. There might be print queues or other sources of information that are not direct. And then at the micro level. So some of the data stores moving down here. These are the places you're going to find data. Master and slave storage. So if you have a master and slave database. Redundant and standby storage. So for example, you might have a company that has machines that are mirroring, and one of the machines is in hot standby mode. So if one machine fails, you can activate the second. This comes in failover load balancing situations. RAID mirroring, data journals, version control, online, offline backups. There's the idea of being able to turn back to Iron Mountain and say, hey, can I have a copy of my data set from 2 weeks ago? That's usually a good source of information. File system journals, meta storage, permitted transfer. Very often, finding evidence in a case when you've got a really well-protected computer system is simply a matter of turning to the people who've had access and have copied the data off of it. Disaster recovery sites, regulatory compliance. In certain situations, certain regulations require that you turn over records to the government or to other organizations. You might have some interesting data there. And file system monitors and logs. Data authenticators. This is a secondary thing. Once you've done your capture, you want anything that can assure that your data is original. Establish a capture agenda. So this comes down to the concept of order of volatility. Here are the things that determine whether or not something is a risk for contamination. How frequently is it accessed? How low level is it? Mutability. Is it easily changed or not? Volatility, probe stability. Are the things you're going to run actually going to crash the system? There are some really wonderful tools out there that will crash the system if you try to use them. Some memory tools do that, unfortunately. And then there's whether or not you think the evidence is anticipated to be relevant or irrelevant. And then start with your stores and then move to the authenticators. Your containers, processor storage, volatile memory, non-volatile memory, and then disk storage is usually the order you want to move. And some in-practice examples. Now, I only put processor state in here because it's interesting from the point of view that it deteriorates within nanoseconds, if not quicker. So it's usually not practical to get, and it also doesn't really provide you very interesting information often, unless you're trying to figure out how malware has performed. And then just moving down this list here. A couple of things that I'll just mention is there's wonderful tools out there to be able to get a lot of process information in Linux, and in Windows you have to download and install some tools, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But there's a reason why this talk tends to be more Linux-centric. And then the mechanisms. Finding your method of access, there are sometimes alternatives. So if you want a lower level read, you might be able to take it from a direct approach, except the problem is direct reads tend to be far more difficult. And then RAID captures. So look at your logical disks. Document the scene, contain your scene. Now, one quick moment I'll mention here before, and I'll just let you guys read this on your own, but one thing to mention is that turning off a machine used to be the old mindset. Immediately pull the plug and secure your environment, but that no longer necessarily applies because, for example, in the case of encrypted root file systems or loopback file systems, if the machine is on, most likely the encrypted file system is mounted and you have access to the data. So if it's not mounted any longer because you powered off the box, now you're in a situation where you have to crack the data. So capture the data, and again, I'll let you kind of follow this, but one thing I want to point out is try to get as much information as possible. So running dmessage or the equivalent, using any information to get drive geometry and drive state is also imperative before you do your imaging. And if safe, synchronize the memory to disk, document everything. And so here's some examples of some of the fields you might have in a spreadsheet that keeps track of your evidence. Evidence needs to be tracked all the way through, whose hands it's in and whose hands it moves through. Fingerprint your capture, secure the evidence, and again, I'll just let you guys cover this on your own. This is an example of a collection. I'll let you guys read this offline, but this is a secure capture. So it's a capture to an encrypted file system, and it grabs everything that's easily accessible through the system. So another aside is on surveillance, establishing honey nets. This can be a really interesting thing, but there are some real liabilities with establishing or leaving a honey net up. If you have a point of entry to the rest of your network, it's usually not a good idea to leave it up. So honey nets can be very dangerous, and there's some preventative measures you can take to try to protect it, like a very granular IDS and absolute fail-safe, and some of the tools that you can get your hands on. The deception toolkit is kind of neat. It's a little bit underdeveloped, but it's very neat. And HoneyD is on the older side, I believe, but it's also very interesting. So preservation, if safe. So once you've captured your evidence, if safe, synchronize the memory to disk, do a cold turkey shutdown, and then follow the secure evidence collection procedures. And then for analysis. So again, moving from physical to logical to the presentation layer, this is just, again, drawing from the physical analysis, you get raw data, and as you move up through, it gets reassembled for being meaningful. Establish an analysis agenda. So again, following the same procedure, you want to recombine your data set. So if there's defragmentation, or if there's fragmentation rather, and if there's a RAID, you might want to reconstruct it for analysis. And then, again, moving from lower to upper levels of abstraction. Analysis, duplicate for analysis, identify the artifacts. Now this is some of the interesting areas that people are using to protect their data. So for example, obfuscated artifacts. Finding the obvious artifacts of files that are sitting on the file system and ready to be looked at, that's easy. But doing carving can be a challenge. And there's both inbound and out-of-bound methods of concealment. And so, for example, looking for deleted data, interleaved data sets, so looking at things like steganography and looking at things like deniable encryption, where you have two file systems built into one, so to speak, and different passwords give you access to different ones. And then out-of-bound data, so file slack space at the end of executable files, volume slack space, non-partition data, the host protected area, other things like that, storing data in sectors that are marked as bad. And then destruction. Analyzing artifacts. There's some interesting things that I'll just mention again. I'll let you guys read this online. At the application layer, sometimes reconstructing a timetable, there's some interesting techniques. For example, Dan Farmer, in one of his articles, referenced that there's a DNS time to live. And through examining the DNS TTL, you might be able to determine when a person accessed a domain. So for internet investigations, this can be very interesting. And then obviously file system looking at the modified accessed and change times, and then the Windows MACE equivalent and journal entries, trace and file log analysis. And then there's the contextual analysis aspect. This is where you're actually trying to figure out what the data means. You've reconstructed the timetable. There's a common analysis using things like strings, for example, to try to determine what the file has in it, identifying it using the file command or looking at the magic values of the file. And then there's tools specific to the applications. There's application analysis. A couple of things here to mention. This is malware analysis. The first thing you want to do is you want to try to figure out what the program is doing. Decompiling it, looking at the strings, these are things that are interesting to approach. But the key here is establishing an environment that's secure. So, an example, the lowest level of protection is using a ch-rooted environment. Now, the dangers of a ch-rooted environment are your file system is the only thing that's being protected. Memory, everything else provides pathways back into the file system because you're not fully separated. A virtual machine like VMware is better, but it's still not the best because there's exploits that have recently demonstrated that VMware applications can actually get past the VMware jails. The best is to have a dedicated machine that's isolated, and then establishing a framework for analysis. So process analysis, having a kernel and library subversion so you can watch actually what the process is doing. And then there's some neat censored execution that will notify you if something in particular is being done. And for Java code, if you have the source code, Globe is a neat element for that. Don't be afraid to involve specialists. As a forensic investigator, your job is to be able to know how to have structure and procedure and to protect the evidence. It's not necessarily your job to be a specialist in every different kind of database out there, for example. So for example, there's no reason not to go off to Oracle and look at one of their Oracle internal specialists, but you have to provide them the forensic environment in which they can work securely. Theorize to objectives, refine the process, and repeat. So you go through this a number of times. Presentation, I'm going to just skip through this very quickly, just some structure and some guidelines for putting together good presentation. Some of the recovery steps here, following policies and procedures, again, confirming your system integrity by eliminating malware and tamperware, provision an up-to-date security system, again, security is anti-forensics, and provide up-to-date system health management, provision secure, incremental archival and backup solutions, and enable the services finally. This is one of the reasons why I love Unix and Linux. These are the tools that are available to you mostly that you can just download. Or rather, mostly they come with your distribution, forgive me. I was thinking more towards the Windows side to download. A couple of things to mention here. The ones that I marked in orange and red can potentially be dangerous because they read the file and change the access times. So one of the first things to do in an investigation, if you have to index a file system live, you're going to want to capture the MAC times in an intelligent way, for example, using something like find or a Windows equivalent that doesn't touch the timestamps of the directories until after it's recorded it. And then some other tools just to mention here. CryptCat is an alternative to Netcat that runs an encrypted underneath SSL, so you have the benefit of encryption for the data if you're doing a remote capture. Some other things to note are in the additional tools section. There's some very interesting stuff out there, and most of that is listed here. DCFL-DD is a DD alternative. It's an extension to DD to allow MD5 while it's DDing, so you don't have to go through your capture and then wait 10 years for it to MD5 it. I emphasize here, by the way, that knowing Perl is a real benefit. And then some interesting Linux locations. I'm just going to kind of run through this relatively quickly for live response in Linux. This is an interesting alternative to using ls. Some people type ls and they find that it might have been compromised. So echo.star or star. A lot of rootkits don't replace echo. And even if they did, you're dealing with bash expansion here. Capturing the date with the time zone. Quick couple of lines on hard drives. HDParm is an interesting tool to speed up your captures. The problem with it is it can be dangerous. For example, don't try to run this on older SCSI drives. Even though it's not applicable to it, you can do some damage. And then some interesting mount options. I'll just let you kind of go through those. DD, a couple of things to mention that are important. No error and sync are probably the two most important options you could pass to DD. Without those, your forensic capture can be greatly compromised. If it has a block read error, DD will naturally stop. That's not necessarily what you want. You want it to keep going. And the second piece to that is you want to use the sync option. And what the sync option does is it buffers out that full block in zeros so that offsets are no longer affected. So for example, if you do a full capture of a drive, including all of the partitions and the boot sector, you'll use output from something like fdisk to be able to mount specific pieces of that. But if you don't do the sync option, you won't have the benefit of being able to mount it because all the offsets will be off. Interesting find line with lots of options to print out everything, and an MD5 line. There's a couple of things. Using netstat is, of course, very important. See what's running on the machine or what's listening and what connections are established. LSOF is a very important utility to determine what files are opened on a live system, and then mount options. Live response in Windows. Back to what I was talking about earlier, there are very few tools that come natively with Windows for live response. Unfortunately, you will have to affect the file system to do a real capture. Some of the places to look are installing Cygwin plus the Unix utils, which gives you some of the basic stuff like a DD on your file system. Sysinternals is an interesting website that, again, I've got the link at the end, that has a lot of tools that accommodate this Linux-like discovery, security focus, and then there's an open source digital forensic sites that has some wonderful tools. Postmortem response tools, to talk briefly about these, the Coroner's Toolkit. I'm sure most of you have heard this name before. Basically, some tools to do data carving, to do low-level examinations of a system. You know, the very, very important tools. One of the tools to mention here is memdump. You know, if you're trying to do a capture of memory, for example, just looking at, for example, dev-mem doesn't necessarily help you because the memory is not contiguous. Memdump accommodates that, at least in the best way it can, and PCAT will actually allow you to dump the memory of a running process. Now, the interesting part about that is you can see what malware might be doing, or you can see what memory, what's loaded in memory. So, for example, if you're trying to find data that's been memory loaded and doesn't exist on the file system, PCAT will help you to find it, to see what process it's been attached to. The Sleuth Kit is an enhancement to the Coroner's Toolkit. The TCT is kind of, it's a little bit of a struggle to use. It has a million different options. It can be there's a large learning curve, even though the benefit is grand. Now, the Sleuth Kit takes some of the tools from the Coroner's Toolkit and enhances them and also makes them a bit easier to use. And some of the tools that they've added are, for example, the Autopsy Forensic Browser, which is an interface system for the Sleuth Kit. So that makes it all graphical. So that brings the Sleuth Kit into the world of something like NCase or FTK. Another couple of things just to mention from the commercial world. NCase is probably the most recognizable tool on the planet. Unfortunately, I don't, and Mr. Henry earlier described how it doesn't necessarily find everything you want. UTK is a package that includes FTK, the password recovery tool, and a lot of other tools that are really, really wonderful. ProDiscover is really moving up there. There's a lot of alternatives. Smart, you know, as he mentioned, was an NCase alternative. And then there's some really interesting cell and PDA seizure tools that Parabon offers. So, and again, the only thing I'll mention here, a couple of things just mentioning. Perl, again, Perl and Expect are two things are really worth looking into and learning. Galetta, Pasco, these things are tools that allow you to examine from an application layer what's happening. Galetta is a cookie analyzer. Building a forensic toolkit. So the first bit to this is building a ruggedized workstation. So lots of memory, having a DVD writer, you know, using the new standards for external interfaces like 1394B. Pretty smart to do. And again, I'll just kind of gun through this and let you discover this on your own. The hardware kit, a couple of things to mention here. You'll find that there are so many different types of connectors, so many different types of interfaces when it comes to drive captures. It's difficult to account for them all. So unfortunately, usually you have to turn to a third-party provider to give you a kit that has all of them. But that's a good way of getting most of them. But this is just a quick list of them. Another thing to mention here are forensic bridges, so things like write blockers. So once you've done a cold turkey shutdown, once you have the drive in your possession, using a write blocker will allow you to examine the drive in a way that won't allow people to write back to it. So, or won't allow you to write back to it by accident, rather. And there's a lot of companies that sell these things. The best one, it's hard to say which is probably the best, but Tableau makes a few really good write blockers, and they also make some adapters, so ATA and SCSI to FireWire. So have spare jumpers, screws, a network switch, a power strip. Having a software kit with something like Knoppix is usually a very good idea. Script interpreters, scanners and crackers can be very valuable here, like Nessus. And software write blockers, PD block. Now, one more mention, I always recommend hardware write blockers over software, but sometimes software is the only alternative that you have. PD block is a software write blocker. Additional tools to have on hand: a Palm Pilot, digital still, video, audio recorder, a computer toolkit, and a Dremel. An LED flashlight. Now, there's some debate as to whether or not white light provides you the best light to be able to examine the colors and cables while you're working on them, but this is just what I personally prefer. A cigarette lighter inverter. A UPS is not a bad thing to carry, even though sometimes it's a bit impractical. Additional supplies to have on hand: evidence forms, so chain of custody. Every movement your evidence makes has to be documented. Evidence tags and seals. There's tamper-proof evidence tape out there so that it can demonstrate. Well, it's not really tamper-proof, but it shows that evidence has been tampered with. Cable ties, anti-static straps, things of that sort. Documentation to have on hand. This is just a good list. At the end of the presentation, there's a list of links that you can find. And what the links have in them is the links have a default list of passwords, and this is kind of interesting. A lot of times corporations, you'll find, won't change their default password, no matter what their security policy might say about it. And there's a list, an online list of passwords, both for wireless devices and all sorts of other things that I find very useful. And then there's pocket science and technology references, which can be really useful, and other things of that sort. This is a very good tool to have on hand when all else fails. You can either shoot your enemy or yourself if you finally give up. Some things just to mention on counterforensics. One of the things that's nice, again, about Linux, so another testament to Linux, this is a secure destruction mechanism. Now, the problem with this is it's not exactly, it doesn't exactly allow you to get your data back, but that's exactly the point. One of the things to mention here: Disk S Reset is a tool that comes with the sleuth kit, and what it does is it opens up the host protected area on your hard drive so that it can be accessed using something like DD. So if you want to do a destruction, you'll want to obviously overwrite whatever's in your host protected area when you've been keeping your files in that area. Just to gun through this very quickly, not to step on any other presentations. Non-destructive techniques, obfuscation and intrusion prevention. Destructive techniques are meta cleansing and data cleansing. So obfuscation, data hiding and fragmentation, encoding encryption, deniable encryption, and steganography. Deniable encryption is something that's very interesting, and it usually comes in the form of having a file system that has multiple layers to it. They're interleaved. So what you end up with is you end up with the ability to turn over your password, and you have a data set that reflects not necessarily the evidence that people are looking for, but the evidence that you want them to see. Intrusion prevention. Now, this may seem funny, perhaps. Disorder, chaos, and entropy. These three words are vital to counterforensics. Providing information overload and false positives is a great way of distracting people looking for your data. Presence and persistence of residual data. So again, Paul Gutman described a way of destroying data, and that's to overwrite it a number of times. Basically moving, as he called it, the magnetic bits around as much as possible. So his method of secure destruction is to overwrite with zeros and then overwrite with a combination of bit patterns that run through a different series of permutations. So you move them around as much as possible and make it even difficult for the guys with the scanning microscopes. And then meta cleansing. There were some tools that were talked about before that allow you to destroy MAC times. What's interesting is that in a court of law, if you can't put together a timeline, your evidence becomes greatly in question, no matter what that evidence is. Because someone could say, that evidence didn't happen as we spoke of while I was employed at this company. And then data cleansing. Some file system tools just to mention. Take a look at these sites. Particularly the phonebook project is very neat, TrueCrypt. These are the deniable encryption file systems that I was mentioning just a moment ago. Metasploit, as Mr. Henry mentioned, is a really interesting anti-forensics project. User and kernel malware. Again, some links to some references to some interesting information. And then absolute tools. Again, back to the brute force method. Melting the hard drive tends to be the only real way of securing the data. And if you'd like some interesting pictures of an effort done with that, turn to CHS's website here, and he's got pictures of it, and without the gas mask, well, see what happens. So take him at the bar, buy him a drink, buy him a Guinness, and you'll see what happens to a person who doesn't wear a gas mask. And then, of course, a Herf gun. This was another cute script that someone sent me that I think is probably worth just throwing in here. Russian roulette for your hard drive. Forensic hardening. I'll talk about this for a moment. Security by design and practice. So identify past, present, and future vulnerabilities in your system. So scan your system. Some network security things to mention. Firewall IDS, IPS, so prevention. Failover load balancing is interesting because there's different ways of having non-homogenized networks, redundant non-homogenized architecture, which gives you the ability to prevent further access to other machines. So if you're storing data across multiple machines and the machines aren't homogenized, that can be a good thing to protect yourself. Now remember, this is not so much anti-forensics as it is hardening your system so that it can resist forensics, both so it can resist it and also so it makes it available in a controlled way for your environment. So data security, external demilitarized logging. So again, I think that where forensics is heading is, instead of doing postmortem analysis, the industry is moving towards more live analysis. And to deal with live analysis means you have to have more data available. So it's more in the preventative area. Once again, being reactive is being proved to be a very dangerous thing. Being preventative is usually the best approach. So having demilitarized logging, having things like tripwire running on your system so you have those MAC times preserved. So if something all of a sudden changes and a file now says it was last accessed in the year 1930, and your tripwire logs show that for many months here, the last time it was accessed was, a week ago. It can be interesting. So demilitarized system health management. The Nagios project is a really good thing here. Again, there's a link in the back here. Allows for very, very granular monitoring and very easy extension. Secure application development, some things to talk about here. When you're developing an application, some things to consider, of course, buffer overflows, cross-site scripting attacks for web projects, things like this. As you're moving along, these end up being the best area to protect yourself. Just one quick point again, if you have a mounted encrypted file system, the encryption may not necessarily help you because your entire disk is now available through an interface, so the loopback device exists. So if you can violate the system, then you have access to that encrypted data and the encryption is done you no good. So once again, secure application development is very important. Application firewalls. EI provides a couple that aren't necessarily the best for IIS. One of them is pretty interesting. Scheduled probes using things like Nessus, scheduled operational readiness tests for your people, and again, having a strict government that describes how your environment works. Some resources that you can turn to for further education, just a couple of lists here. Lots and lots of links. I'll just mention a couple of them that I think are particularly worth mentioning. Foremost, which is the fourth from the bottom there, is a very, very interesting site. There's a tool there that allows for file carving. Now most of these tools that are listed on the next 3 pages are free tools, and they're really worth looking into. Again, my goal here is to provide a framework and then throw out a tremendous number of terms in this presentation so that people can go and look it up and learn more, since an hour really isn't enough. The Penguin Sleuth Kit is another really interesting package. It's a Knoppix extension for forensic analysis. So it's been hardened in many ways similar to the Anonymous OS, so to speak, although that project is very different and has a lot of really neat stuff. But the Penguin Sleuth Kit is specific for not touching things in the course of a forensic investigation live. So Lanza packets, that site, the Pheno Elite, this is the site that has the list of default passwords worth taking a look at, and a lot of other interesting links. Secure programming is a wonderful how-to as a starting point for a development team on how to avoid certain kinds of overflows from input validation to things of that sort. Sysinternals, Tau Security, these are all really good websites. You'll notice I put Vico in here. It's a very neat site to just look at. These are the people in the industry. If you want to learn more, a great place to start is with their websites or to look for their names on the internet. Brian Carrier wrote the Sleuth Kit and the AFB. Eoghan Casey has a lot of interesting text on investigation, not necessarily tools. Dan Farmer. Oren Kerr, who I mentioned earlier, has some wonderful articles on criminal procedure and cyber law. So if you're going to get into criminal procedure and forensic investigations, this is a person to really turn to and look at. Bruce Schneier for encryption. And Venema, who worked with Farmer on the Coroner's Toolkit and also wrote Postfix. A couple of the books that I think are really important people get their hands on. Towards the bottom, I just threw in understanding the Linux kernel to remind people that knowing how your system works at a very low level is very important. This is a very good book just for entertainment. I recommend this to everyone to have a sense of humor. And on top of it, this is all very relevant because Dirk Gently was a forensic investigator. So I'm justified. So The Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul, good book. And then if you want to turn to commercial organizations, at a certain point in your investigation, you're not going to be able to go any farther with the tools that you have. And so you'll want to turn to a commercial organization to support your effort. KPMG has an interesting department. They're kind of difficult to, they're a little bit difficult to work with from my experience. Navigant Consulting is good. The last one, Kroll, used to have a strong forensic investigation team, but they've been losing people to the upper three. Drive Savers is a company to turn to if you have a hard drive password that you haven't been able to get past. They're an interesting place to go to if you heard bad noises coming from the hard drive and you need literally a clean room to work on the drive. They have a storeroom with every drive controller you can imagine, and then some other commercial sites to take a look at. And I threw EI on here because they've got a lot of interesting concepts, but when it comes to security scanners, there was a recent article that was put out on, that NIST did, studying what the different scanning tools were, and they came to the conclusion that Nessus was the #1 scanner and that ISS was the #2 scanner. EI came in, their Retina product came in fairly low behind, but it's got some really interesting stuff. I think that they just need to get a little bit more detailed in their implementation, but other than that, they've got some good stuff. And that, I think, that wraps it up for me. So I'm going to post this on the LayerOne website, so it's good for procedure, and it's good for some other notes and to go further. And if you'd like to email me with questions, you are welcome to. And this last slide will be on my on the project plan, or this PowerPoint when I upload it. So, any questions, if anyone is still awake? Where?
No. What was the URL of that guy trying to melt down his hard drive?
You'll have to get that from this gentleman right over here, the living URL right here.
driveslag.eq.com.
He did that in his backyard. Yes?
In the forensics investigation, installing software on the box, how does that stand up in a court of law? During the forensics investigation, because you're changing the evidence.
It doesn't necessarily affect it because the end evidence is going to be the files. However, the bigger concern you have is overwriting the files that are there. So those tools are really useful to put on the machine in the beginning as a starting point. But again, in some systems, sometimes pulling the plug is really the only option that you've got. So you do whatever analysis you can with the tools that are online, and then you do the cold turkey shutdown and do the drive analysis later where you have better tools. Affecting the data set is not necessarily so bad from a court of law point of view. The most important thing, though, is not to destroy potential data that's been obfuscated or deleted or anything of that sort. Does that answer the question? Okay. Any other questions? Yes?
Is there a place to go where they actually have like a drive image, and then there's like a case that someone would like to that's where you can download the image and then play with it?
Oh, you mean for personal development? Sure, there's lots of places. If you go to, I think the best ones are available from Carrier's site. Let me see if I have it listed here. It's called Digital Evidence, I think it is. So the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that has some interesting links to some data. But also, as has been mentioned earlier, it's also good to potentially just go on eBay and get a hard drive and then do an analysis on that. That can be very good. There's also, I believe, and I haven't looked at the disc sets of it because unfortunately I didn't want to lay out 50 or 60 bucks for the book, but there's some CDs that come with some of the books out there that have examples in them. I think, let me move back to the book section here. I think it's the Real Digital Forensics book. The one, there you go. Second one there, Real Digital Forensics, I believe comes with a CD with some examples. And also the file system book, which is written by Carrier, also has some examples on it to look at some interesting images. Does that? Very good. Any other questions? Yes?
Have you ever dealt with a scenario where somebody was using a pretty secure live CD and there was no hard drive involved?
I personally haven't. Colleagues of mine have. Usually that's when you turn to the programs like memdump to get contiguous memory dumps of what's on the system. Again, once that machine has been powered off, there's nothing you can do. So again, moving away from cold turkey shutdown. But that's generally the approach.
Does that mean you need some kind of console access to log?
Yeah. Well, it doesn't need console access, but it needs a login, obviously. But it doesn't need console access to run the memdump. I think that the older versions required that you log in as root. I think some of the newer versions will, unless your kernel has got, for example, in Linux, if you're running a kernel that has something like GR security, then usually you're set. GR security segregates processes from being able to see each other's memory. Does that answer? Okay, very good. Any other questions? I think that wraps it up.